Hello my friends. What I have here is chaga and it's in a prep form. This has been broken down into small chunks, and this other one is into a fine powder. It's almost like ground coffee. Okay, now how to use this to be most effective. We're going to do an extract. Most people will use chaga as a tea, where they do a hot water extraction, very similar to brewing tea. The only problem is a lot of the medicinal components that's in the chaga is water insoluble. So in order to get the best benefits from chaga, you need to do a two-part extraction. And the first part is going to be making a tincture, and I'm using alcohol, and this is 100% alcohol, or I'm sorry, 100 proof alcohol, which is 50% alcohol. So what you want to do is take your chaga, put it into some type of a vessel, and you're going to submerge it or bury it in the alcohol. And I'm using both the finely ground and the stuff that was broken up. And we need to add the alcohol. You want to cover all the chaga with the alcohol, and I'm trying to get every bit of it. So I'm rinsing the containers out. You need to add enough alcohol that you can cover the chaga. You want to leave a little bit of head space in your container. Now this chaga should remain soaking in the alcohol for 6 to 8 weeks, and it should be shaken daily, twice daily if you can remember. So that's a long wait for this first process, but this is how to extract the water insoluble components that's in there. Well, it's been about 8 weeks, and you need this set every day with stirring. When I stirred, it was just slushing around, and every day you want to do that, once or twice a day. There's a couple days that I missed because I was away, but this set about 8 weeks. Okay, so this should have done the extraction of the water insoluble components, and the next step now is going to be a heat process, and this goes over a 3-day period. Okay, now we want to remove the alcohol or the liquid from the chaga, and I'm going to strain it. I have this brewing funnel, and if you look at the bottom of the funnel, there's an insert right here, a real fine screen. If you don't have something like this, just use cheesecloth, and you can pick that up. Most stores, I think that's came from Walmart. Okay, now we're going to run this through. It would be nice to have a second hand. Ooh, yep, that's alcohol. What's left in here, I'll rinse and put that into the pot. Then we measure the solution. And the reason we're going to measure this is we need to simmer. We'll bring the water to a boil and simmer the chaga and reduce the liquid, and we're going to do that over a 3-day period. We're going to heat it up, simmer it, we're going to reduce the liquid down to about 50%, and then let it cool overnight, and that process will be soaking and extracting the water-soluble components. And then we repeat the process again. And what we're going to do as a tincture, you want this tincture to be preserved and last basically indefinite, and the alcohol is your preservation agent or component that will be in there. Now, when you brew and make a wine, it's recommended that you get your wine to a minimum of 10% alcohol content. I always try to reach the 12% alcohol. If it's below the 10%, the wine may spoil because it doesn't have a high enough alcohol content. Now with the tincture, they recommend, or it's recommended, that you get to a 20% alcohol content. And I'm going to shoot for that, if not 25%. But even erring to the lower side, where it could be a 10 to 12% alcohol content, it should be preserved just as a wine would be preserved. So since this is a 100 proof vodka that we're using, so this is right now it's 50% alcohol. So if I would match this volume in water, that would reduce that alcohol by half, so that would give me 25% alcohol in the solution. And that's what I'm going to target, and if I err either way, it's still well above the 10 to 12%, which would preserve wine, and it will be over the 20%, which they recommended for the tincture. After pouring off the vodka from the jar, we finished with 4 cups. The chaga is still saturated with the vodka, which will not matter. When we put it into the pot and do the hot water, that liquid will leach into the water. Alcohol is water soluble, so it will leach out. Also, it will evaporate, but it's leaving the components behind as it evaporates. And for that reason, I put this in a sealed jar so the alcohol is not evaporating. So this will be put aside, and when I add the water, I'm going to be adding the 4 cups, reducing it down to 2 cups, and do that 3 days in a row. So let's begin with day 1, heat reduction. Now when you go to add water, you want to add a non-chlorinated water. So I'm using spring water. You could use distilled water. Now I put a cup of water in here to rinse this out. Now the volume of water that you're using, like I said, I'm adding 4 cups and reducing it down. If I added more water, for example 6 or 8 cups, and reduced it down, as long as my final volume of water is going to equal the amount of vodka that I have left, you're okay, because the concern is that you reduce that 100 proof down to a 50 proof, or getting it to the 25% alcohol content. So as long as it's reduced down, you're fine to where you're to the equal volume. Okay, now I'm going to heat this up. I'll bring it to a boil and then turn it down to a simmer and let it simmer until the volume decreases. And all you need is an idea. You don't have to be precise. So that looks like about 2 inches. I'll heat it until I get down to about 1 inch. Then I'm going to turn it off, let it set overnight, and let the water do extraction, and then repeat the process 2 more times. Because I've used a powder chaga with the fine ground, it has a tendency to want to clump on the bottom. So when you're bringing this up to a boil, make sure that you stir it so that you're not baking this piece on the bottom. I reduce the heat and have it to a simmer, and you can see the steam coming off. Now the alcohol that was left, the residual alcohol that was left in the chaga, it will be gone. There will be no alcohol left in this solution. Alcohol boils at or evaporates at a lower temperature than water. So the first thing to leave the solution was the alcohol. This is after the 3rd day of rendering. And you can see I have it down. And if you remember when I did the initial test, I had about 2 inches. We're at about 1.5 inches, so I'm slightly under. What I need to do now is drain this liquid and measure what we have, and then I'm going to add some more water to try to get all the liquid that it's holding, all the nutrients, to get it removed from this. Okay, this is going to have to sit for a while for the liquid to keep draining. You can see here. And it's steaming because it's still warm. Let's leave that sit for a while and measure our liquid. Here I'm trying to coax the last of the liquid out of the chaga, and when it's done draining, this is going back into the pot and it's going to make tea. Here we have the alcohol extract of the chaga, and it's a half a jar. It's 4 cups. We kept it sealed to keep the alcohol from evaporating. And this is the hot water extract, and let's see what we have. Okay, we are slightly under the mark, which that's fine. We're going to be, when we mix the two, we will have greater than 25% alcohol content. So 20% is what's recommended. If it was a 50-50 mix here, we would end up with the 25% alcohol. So we're probably pushing around 30% alcohol content with this. And what you can do is top it up with distilled water. So you have the 25% mix. Here we have Chaga tea simmering. This is the remains of our extract. Here's how I'm going to store my Chaga tincture. And these bottles, they hold a 1/4 cup of liquid. And they're pretty easy to fill this way. What you want to do is make sure that you label the bottles and put the date on them so you don't lose track of what you have going. And the recommended dose for using this would be a teaspoon in an 8-ounce glass. You can add it to a drink or a smoothie, or you take a dropper full of this and oral application once a day. Thanks for watching, my friends. Bye-bye.